and I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers for this session. We're joined by Kieran Gilpin, a professional athlete, motivational speaker and designer, and we're also joined by Jamie Rogers from Diverse Supply. Jamie is a former head teacher and a board member at Ed Diversity at Blackpool. I'm now going to pass over to our first speaker, Kieran. Kieran's going to provide his personal insight into the topic. Over to you, Kieran.
Thank you ever so much. Can I just double check that you can see me and hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you ever so much. So, good afternoon, guys. I just want to spend the next few minutes giving my personal reflections and insights on my experience around pupil referral units. It's actually quite a personal experience, and I would love to just bring you on that journey with me. So I moved to England when I was young, when I was 7, and the first few years in primary school was a little bit rocky, just kind of bit due to the cultural differences. And in year 6, I actually got expelled from school and had to go to a pupil referral units, and that's when I was first ever even made aware of alternative provisions. Being at the pupil referral unit in primary school, I remember it being quite a challenging environment, because where I was one challenging student in a classroom of 30, I was now a challenging student in a classroom of 6 other challenging students. So there were lots and lots of fights. It was quite a volatile environment. A few years later now, when I was in secondary school, a tragic incident happened in my family. And I'm going to just touch on it a little bit to kind of give an insight on the complexities that students are going through. And I know everyone's story is different, everyone's story is unique, but I'm going to give a little insight into my own, because that was just the reality. That's my story. This is what happened. So in year 9, a tragic incident happened in my family, quite horrific, and it had a profound impact on my mum. My mom is the head of her siblings. She's the oldest of her siblings, so she acts as a mother figure to her siblings. And this incident that took place had a profound impact on my mom, like a profound impact. She became broken, and this had an unimaginable amount of this put an unimaginable amount of weight on my shoulders, on my mind, seeing my mom in this state. And going into school every day became a whole different experience. Just leaving from a home with a mom who's broken, with a mom who no longer have that life. And being someone from Jamaica, I'm used to the reggae music, the cooking, a very vibrant environment that just got flipped on its head due to the incident in my family. So this is when behaviors started flaring up noticeably in school. And whilst this was happening, unfortunately, there was the inclusion unit where I started spending a lot of my time, which is like an internal exclusion. And what happened is the behavior just kind of worsened and was quite challenging in some cases. And the schools thought best to put me in a pupil referral unit at the time. Now, at this time in my life, there was the gang violence in my area was peaking. It was absolutely peaking to the point where leaving the house, we wasn't even sure as young people if we'll come back home. And up until today, I'm still wondering, why would I leave and go into certain areas knowing the level of dangers that was there? But you know, we still did that. We still went out. We still traveled when possible. However, my pupil referral unit, the one I should attend, was in the heart in the heart of an opposition, of a gang estate. It was at the heart of it. So it was just kind of a no to be going to the pupil referral unit. And I remember one day I kind of attempted to go to see the space, see what it's like, and that did not turn out. That there was not a good outcome to that. So I made uh, an executive decision at that age to say, "Do you know what, I can't attend for my own safety, for my own health. I can't attend this pupil referral unit. So the only other option was to just remain on the streets and see people. Now, at this point in my life is when I was desperate for a sense of belonging, desperate for a sense of community, and being excluded from school has a bigger impact than a lot of people would imagine. You know, you miss friends, you miss teachers. There was teachers I could no longer see, and I got on so well with so many of my teachers. And you know, the word lives up to the name. Like, I felt excluded. You know, and at this time, the local boys, the street corner kids, they were the one, you know, giving me a sense of belonging, a sense of direction, making me feel as though I was a part of a community. Now, during this time, things became extremely delicate. There was such a thin line between life and death at this time. I started hearing about one of our friends getting stabbed, another friend being stabbed, this guy got murdered. Like, it became so normal that many of us became a little bit desensitized to it. We could only kind of, you know, send our condolences and kind of give a moment of silence before just moving on with our day, and telling each other, be safe, roll safe, take care, because there wasn't any certainty that we'll be seeing each other the following day. And yeah, this was very, very turbulent times in my life. And when I think about being high risk, this was the highest risk during this episode. Um a few years later now, I've actually started doing motivational speaking, going into schools, working with students who are at risk of exclusion, going into working with young people in the young offending service, working with young people in pupil referral units. And it felt like such a blessing to have such a broad perspective on young people, what they're going through, and how best to go about engaging them and having them feel that sense of community, that sense of belonging at school, having them, you know, see the joy in taking their work seriously and exploring their potential. And I started to do all of this at school, working with young people risk of exclusion, and the insights has just been absolutely enlightening in many ways. So what I've learned from being in these spaces is 8 times, 9 times out of 10, students that are acting up are going through quite a lot in their personal lives. And these are young people both in both at secondary mainstream school and those who have been excluded. Often, if you just look beyond the child and see the circumstances, you get to, you know, put a picture together and see that this is no normal average upbringing. It's not a normal situation, and it's worth investigating before penalizing the child for this, that, and the other. It's worth understanding where they're coming from, what the challenges are. And with this awareness, it's enabled me to build very strong rapport with young people, and given me the privilege to see their potential and kind of see what they're capable of, and just form a trusting relationship where they will open up and share their fears, their anxieties, but also their ambitions. And this awareness has given me great capacity to empathize with students who are, you know, at risk of exclusion, or who are labeled the naughty kids. And I've also been able to connect with young people in prisons, in pupil referral units, in young offender service. And again, each time that I connect and sat with these students, I would hear horrific things that kind of reminded me of my own story. And those stories are very different. There was a level of trauma, and this could be from the home, mom, dad, domestic violence, It could be issues in the community, people, families being caught up in conflict. It could be mental health, and the list just goes on and on and on. And I've basically arrived at a space that I strongly believe to truly form a fair perspective on the matter. It's just so important to sit with the child, to learn about the student, to learn about what they're going through, to learn and listen to their story and see what's bothering them the most. And when behaviors are flaring up, there's often a direct link to situations at home, situations with the family. I've been extremely successful with developing programs and delivering workshops, and staff members, their jaws drop when they see the level of engagement and how willing students are to be on their best behavior and to take their education serious. And this group of young people, what they've taught me is that there's a few key fundamentals that need to be in place for them to truly bring their maturity into the space, for them to bring their intelligence into the space, and for them to kind of afford you their attention. And what these key values are that they ask is respect. They want to be respected. They want authenticity. They want realness. These are students who are so used to being let down. They're so used to people giving up on them. They're so used to being misunderstood that, to be honest, there's actually a negative expectation for them to be excluded or put to the side or labeled. But once these students can see the realness, once they can see the authenticity, once you're willing to engage with them and they can see that this is not just a job, you honestly see the brightest potential. You see, like, you see the good side to the students, and they're just absolutely amazing. They're so inspiring. You see the courage, the resilience. Like, these students, I celebrate them for just showing up. I celebrate them for making an effort. And that wouldn't really happen in a mainstream school. But in a PRU, you have the opportunity to bond with these students because the groups are so much smaller. So you're seeing 6 to 8, maximum 10 students. They have the opportunity to have that one-to-one mentorship, and each student has a key worker where they could talk about their emotions, they could talk about their feelings. And this environment is far more conducive to their development than a mainstream school. And what I've learned being in pupil referral units is that it is a very challenging environment. It is extremely challenging because you have students coming from all walks of life with different issues that they're processing and dealing with. And then staff members are the pressure on staff members are great. They're so great. But each staff member that I connect with in the PRU, they seem to lead with kindness. They seem to be well trained when it comes to managing behavior, conflict resolution, taking a student-centered approach to engaging and uplifting the students. And that's been quite refreshing to see. And that's one of the main differences with the pupil referral units and the schools, is that each child can have that kind of focus, and it's a space that is full of incentives. You know, students get gift cards for showing up, for having great attendance, and these incentives matter. And without them, some students wouldn't even show up. So there has to be, they say necessity is the mother of innovation, and PRUs are forced to be innovative. And that kind of leads me on to the point I would love to drive home today. And it's the fact that I honestly think we need more genius in the space. We need people from diverse backgrounds, diverse walks of life being involved in PRUs. And absolutely, yes, on a board level, you know, I still believe that if I had a diverse board at the time when I was in school, there would have been a bit more empathy, there would have been a bit more understanding, or there would have been more effort to understand who the child is, what he's going through, what his life, what does his life look like. And that's exactly what's needed today in schools still, and even more so needed in PRUs. And the reason I believe it's needed is fairly different. I would say representation in mainstream schools, absolutely. That's why we ought to aim to diversify boards as much as possible. In PRUs, I would say the skill sets are needed, the networks are needed, the creativity is needed. Stakeholders are needed. So being involved in PRUs will just help the staff, help the provision to have that leverage to empower their students. I've recently delivered a program at a PRU over in East London, and the success of the project was hinging on me and my team's creativity to engage these students. We needed to use, animation, like things need to jump on the screen for them to see it. You need to be very meticulous with the execution, with the process, with the engagement. And honestly, what's possible when there's some creativity and innovation in the space is just mind-blowing. Even the staff members, their jaws were on their chest, just seeing how well behaved, how engaged the students were. And I want to just end on the point of collaboration, like the need for collaboration, the need for diverse people getting together, thinking about the issues of a provision or a school, and ideating, starting a think tank to see how can we optimize processes, how can we better engage our students, who do we personally know in our networks that can add value to student development or to the development of the provision, what guest speakers can we bring in, what programs can we fund, what monies can we raise, what technology can we introduce. And I think by doing so, we are changing lives, we are transforming communities, and ultimately creating a better future for the next generation. And with that said, I really just want to encourage everybody on the call today, to continue to think, what board do you want to sit on? Who's in your friendship group? Who are your associates? Who do you work with? Who could you encourage to consider the role of a governor, in PRUs and mainstream schools? Because the need is absolutely great. But I know for sure that we are not short of skills, we are not short of genius, and it's just a matter of inviting them into the conversation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for that, Kieran. Yeah, we hear about diversity of skills a lot, but diversity in backgrounds and walks of life is just as important here in this context. A really insightful and useful reflection, and thank you for your honest and open reflection there. The awareness of the topic really highlighted through your story. Giving time to understand student situations coming across really is key there. So now, moving over to Jamie, our second speaker, who is delivering a presentation as part of the session. Over to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Charlie, and thanks, Kieran, for really powerful kind of insight into what your journey was. I'm going to flip it a little bit and potentially be slightly more, definitely more boring than Kieran's kind of personal reflections and powerful story, and talk about what kind of we need to know as school governors. So I'm going to share my screen, and I don't think I'll be able to see anything on screen. So Charlie, I'm going to ask you to let me know when you can see my presentation in just a second. Let's try that. There we go. Charlie, have you got me?
We have indeed.
Fantastic, thank you. I think I'm qualified in some ways to talk about alternative provisions for a number of reasons. Obviously, Kieran is the perfect person to talk about having his experience of a pupil referral unit. I was fixed term excluded as a pupil myself, which means I didn't go to a pupil referral unit, but I spent time away from my school for behavior issues. And then later on as a primary school head teacher, I did use exclusion. So I've got kind of two angles in which I come at this. And that journey as a school leader led me to work for an organization called The Difference. And The Difference takes leaders from mainstream schools and helps to train them as pupil referral unit leaders, senior leaders, with the aim that at the end of those 2 years, they go back to a mainstream school and spread that inclusive practice. So I've done lots of work across 30 or 40 different pupil referral units. I'm thinking about exclusion, alternative provision, pupil referral units a lot in that work. I'm still doing a little bit for the difference, but I've recently set up a company called Diverse Supply Recruitment and Retention, looking at ethical ways for schools to recruit. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that today, but while I'm on a call full of school governors, I'm going to show off a little bit and say that I am a proud governor of a pupil referral unit in Blackpool in the northwest of England, and we had our Austin inspection in the last couple of weeks of term last year, and I'm proud to say we remain a good pupil referral unit. So I'm going to keep moving through and spend less time gloating about that. And in this kind of section, I'm going to look at a couple of things that I think it's useful to know. So what is alternative provision? Even more basic than that, not every governor that I come across knows what a pupil referral unit is. We're going to think about what kind of questions you need to ask as a governor to know how well your school is accessing alternative provision. Kieran used a beautiful example there. Well, certainly wasn't beautiful for Kieran, but a great example of a system that's not working well when he was placed in a pupil referral unit in an area where he probably shouldn't have been placed. And that's the kind of thinking and joining the dots that school leaders need to be doing. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that at board level as governors too, and go through some of the kind of statutory guidance that we need to think about too. So I'm not going to read it out loud, but on the screen there, the Department for Education's kind of definition of alternative provision is basically any place a child goes away from their mainstream school to receive education. And that could be for a health reason, or because they've been excluded, or because they need to improve their behavior. And this is alternative provision is a word that you might hear, but it has several kind of components that can make it up. So the things listed here, I know Kieran mentioned internal APs. Lots of schools are starting to have that within their own mainstream setting. Pupil referral units, which I'll explain in a minute, AP-free schools. All these things here would be classed as a type of alternative provision, but we're going to focus on, in this kind of section, pupil referral units and AP-free schools and how a mainstream school might access those as well. It's important to understand your local context. So every locality, every local authority will have a different offer when it comes to alternative provision. Your local context is really, really important, and you'll probably find that your local authority will have what's called an SEND local offer on a website somewhere. You can track that down and you can see the different types of alternative provisions that are used in your area. But pupil referral unit tends to be somewhere a child is forced to go because they might need to improve their behavior for a fixed period of time, or they might go to that pupil referral unit alongside a mainstream school and kind of access two settings at once in what's called being dual registered. So they'll make up some of their learning in their normal, the mainstream school and also in their pupil referral unit. Yeah, I think it's becoming increasingly common that alternative provision academies, which is very similar to pupil referral units in lots of instances, and AP-free schools are cropping up in lots of localities nationwide. So there's something to be aware of, that you might hear these terms bandied around, and you have to take quite a close look at the specific locality that you're in to understand what is the offer in your region too. Now, one of the things that I really loved about the way Kieran put across his journey is the work he's doing now. He's talking about staff in alternative provision that lead with kindness, that are experts in conflict resolution. And it can be a really jaded and old stereotype that pupil referral units are a bit like a prison or a dumping ground. You chuck the kids there, it's like a youth club. And my experience of working in, I would say I've been to probably 20% of all the pupil referral units in the country, is that that's not the case. When alternative provision and PRU is done well, good academic achievement is at the forefront of all the work that the school does. Getting children qualifications so they go on to not be NEETs, so that they actually do go into education, employment, or training post-16 is really fundamental to a lot of the work that gets done. There's a focus on breaking down the barriers to attainment, really kind of a guided path. And Kieran mentioned this really, really clearly, kind of understanding what a child needs to be able to succeed is core to what good AP is and feels like as well. You'll often hear a discussion around registered versus unregistered provision. Now, registered provisions are any kind of alternative provision that provides education for 5 or more children, or a child that's looked after, or a child who is in care. Sorry, a child who's in care and looked after, or a child with an EHCP. Sometimes schools will access unregistered provision. So this might be something like an animal-based alternative provision, or very specific and often quite niche things. And it's really important, as we go through this, we'll get into it, that we understand why unregistered provision might be used by your school, and there's a clear rationale for that. So kind of what do governors need to know? What questions should we be asking? And why this is important? links, I think, to the individual experience of the child first and foremost. I think I've shared a lot of kind of snippets here of key documents, but the experience for the child who's been excluded for school, I think there was, that can be a traumatic experience that can come with an emotional baggage with it. You've been asked to leave somewhere that you've been told for whatever reason you're not welcome. That child then deserves a good education from that point forward. And that's set out in different legislation that we're all familiar with as governors. So keeping children safe in education comes out from a safeguarding perspective. And it's not to say just because a child has gone to an AP that you can wash your hands, you can forget that child ever existed and it's somebody else's problem. It's really clear in legislation that that is not how schools should be working. And we can hold schools to account as governors in different ways to make sure that doesn't happen. But as well as the safeguarding angle, Ofsted are really clear. There needs to be clear rationale for how alternative provision is used, that the quality of education must be strong, that you as a governing body, there are some questions you can ask, school leaders will be asking as well, to make sure that alternative provision use is appropriate. So what I mean by appropriate, is it suitable and safe? Is it effective? Is it preparing children and students for the next step? Is it meeting SEN needs or disability needs? Are we able to access education healthcare plans? Have we done research to make sure safeguarding arrangements are secure? And schools can access alternative provision in a range of different ways. They might access it through a local authority offer, in which case the local authority might have done lots of this vetting and will share that with school leaders. Or if it is an unregistered provision, it'll be on school leaders to make sure safeguarding arrangements are in place. So this is the big red flag that governors always worry about, is if these things aren't done, you are at risk of getting a flaw and inadequate in the Ofsted framework for leadership and management. So if you don't make effective use of AP, you haven't checked the safeguarding settings, you haven't checked the curriculum is clearly sequenced, and this will fall at school leaders level, but governors have every right to ask questions to make sure that these kind of checks have taken place. At any time, it's very, very good practice that governing bodies are asking and tracking the number of pupils who are attending AP in your setting over time. That might fall to a committee level, could be something you're asking at regular board meetings, but it is a good idea to monitor that and ask probing questions to kind of who, what, why, whens. Obviously, anonymized data is going to be shared there with governors, but it's important to keep an eye on that over time. And we take responsibility for pupils who attend. I'm going to move through this slide quickly. These are some of the guiding principle questions that are often asked by school leaders to make sure AP is appropriate. So I think one of the key kind of things I always talk to, and when I've been on governing bodies myself or mainstream schools, is exploring those numbers, checking the registration status of APs used. It's very kind of good practice at committee level potentially to ask probing questions around why this AP, why that AP. Are we thinking carefully about what specific needs children have? In the example Kieran gave, is it appropriate for a particular child to be going to an area that we know isn't safe for them? And ultimately, we can ask questions that hold account for value for money of the governing body. So AP comes at a cost, and if we don't get children going on to not become neat, so if we don't get children going on to meaningful next steps, if we don't get children reintegrating, which we'll talk about in a minute, we can ask questions to clarify what we might do differently to make that happen. So at the end of a placement, often with a fixed term placement, so if a child is not permanently excluded, but we think there is a possibility they can come back to their mainstream school, a process called reintegration takes place, and that takes really careful planning. But it can be a good indicator to the kind of quality of AP used to look at the reintegration rates. Are we able to get children that short-term need that work that they need to improve their behaviour, and then bring them back to our school successfully? And you might ask questions as a governor to ask what that process looks like, what kind of planning and consideration goes into that. And it's all about making sure those children, year 11 is a really common time for children to be excluded. At the end of year 11, are we working with AP able to get them into meaningful training or employment? What is their next step? How can we work together to arrange that? So anonymized data around next steps is also something that's really, really good practice for governors to ask questions about and monitor over time. Yeah, again, that's just a kind of recap on that. But one of the reasons where this is kind of taken from lots of analysis of Ofsted inspections, but where schools fall down on their use of AP and where it's often pointed out in Ofsted inspections is these areas here: not sufficiently checking the safeguarding of alternative provision providers. Attendance can go really quickly fall by the wayside if a child is kind of between two settings, people not necessarily tracking attendance accordingly. And that monitoring and keeping in touch, like I said, just because a child has been moved to an alternative provision or a pupil referral unit doesn't mean that that's not your problem. You wash your hands of them. Lots of teamwork and collegiate and collaborative work is needed to make sure that goes well. But the kind of final thought that I think is a real Achilles heel that many schools do get tripped up on, and one of the things that governors can often overlook, is you might have a large secondary school or a large primary school. You could have 2,000 pupils at your school, but if one child of yours goes to alternative provision and inadequate checks have taken place, that is a serious safeguarding failure. So the governing body has a real role to play, I think, in making sure alternative provision is accessed properly by schools, talking with school leaders to make sure that the process is robust. And yeah, if you have any questions or you wanted to dig into that more detail, I know we've got some time for questions in a moment. I'm always very happy to help any governing body to think carefully about how your school is using alternative provision too. Charlie, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. An incredibly informative presentation there. Thank you for that. One question that we just had come in is, what can we do as governors to help avoid the need for AP, especially if it's common? So like year 11, like you referenced, what can governors do to help avoid the need, really, preventative measures in the first place?
I think it's a really great question. I think there's often there are lots of discussions around like whether exclusion should be a thing, if we should be excluding pupils from schools at all. Should we eradicate the need for alternative provision? That year 11 question is a really good point. So kind of two answers to that would be, actually sometimes the resources that you have in a mainstream school can only be finite. You can't necessarily put what's needed in place for particular children to get the support they need. A bit like the schools I've worked with the difference, a bit like Kieran was saying, the specific skill set can't always live in one building. So a mainstream school, as we're calling it for purposes of this presentation, they will only ever have a finite resource. And actually it isn't necessarily a bad thing if a child is in alternative provision, if that's the best place for them to be, in my opinion. Lots of people have contrasting and different opinions, and I think there's lots of valid debates on this. But I think the most important thing, certainly from the children that I've worked with and seen, is that they go on to access meaningful education, employment, or training. That becomes such kind of a powerful arc in this as well. So it is a great question. And year 11 is a particularly interesting time because, there's not a lot of time to make sure things are put in place to make sure that post 16 they go on to meaningful next steps. But sometimes alternative provision is, from my experience and what I've seen, the best place for some young people to be, especially when alternative provision is done right.
Well, a follow-on question then, I suppose, sort of relating still, is there still a stigma attached to alternative provision? And if so, what can be done to dilute this? Might pass that to Kieran initially, and then to follow on from that, Jamie.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna start with the first question, if that's all right. Just share a few thoughts on that. What can we do as governors to help avoid the need for alternative provision? There is so much that can be done, so much. That's such a broad question. And there probably will always be a need for it because needs aren't being met at home, which means students will show up with all these unmet needs. And to be quite frank, schools just don't have the capacity to attend to those needs, so the AP will need to be there. However, there's still a lot we can do to mitigate that need and just show up for the students the right way. One of which I would say CPD, like putting a great emphasis on continued professional development for staff members, because it's almost as if teachers can't just be teachers nowadays. Like teachers need to be like behavioral experts, engagement specialists. It's like you need all of that just to be able to teach. And I think there are some great concepts that can really empower a staff member to empower and inspire his students, his or her students. You know, there's so many personal qualities that I have that that's so that's so prolific in the education sector, and anyone could develop these qualities. I'll give an example. I'll give one example. So a book, Words That Change Mind. This book is so effective in understanding how to motivate people, right? And they've got a concept, motivation triggers and convincer strategies. Like, any human being armed with the knowledge in this book can better engage students, can better motivate any human being. It's not just students, be it your own children, family members, the love of your life. You're better able to communicate with anyone armed with this knowledge. And I think CPD sessions where staff members are empowered and just given the tools, the thinking tools, the engagement tools, given the tools and resources required to better engage, to better motivate, will be really, really helpful in keeping the classroom regulated and fit for learning and for thriving. The question in terms of how could you repeat the second question? Greatly appreciated.
Yep. So is there still a stigma attached to alternative provision? And if so, what can be done to dilute that?
There is. I spend a lot of time in alternative provisions, and sometimes even staff members who are in the alternative provisions, you know, there's a certain narrative going on. And because I'm a motivational speaker, I'm super sensitive with language. Words of affirmation is my love language, so I'm very mindful with how we speak to students. And there is a stigma attached both internally and externally, and I think that could be reimagined by the change in language, like finding words like courageous and courage, seeing the young people's courage and celebrating them for the efforts they're making, right? Because when you actually check in on some of the students, they might not be getting the best results, but based upon where they're coming from, they're doing exceptionally well. And it's about recognizing that and really holding that up and creating a positive culture where students are just constantly being celebrated for the efforts that they're making. Staff members are being celebrated for the impact that they're having, and then there's more creativity being infused into projects, into engagements, etc. I think that could be really, really helpful in transforming the atmosphere and diluting that stigma. It's almost as if the provisions in charge, taking charge of the narrative and saying, this is how we speak to students, this is how we speak to our colleagues, and this is what we represent. These are the values, and we're going to uphold them to the highest, but put it on a pedestal for mainstream schools to see, for local councils to see, for members of the community to see that students are making great strides towards their education and towards becoming a better version of themselves.
Definitely. Anything to add to that, Jamie?
Only that I spent the last 3 years trying to shift that mindset in teachers. So what we did, the difference was we had this program where mainstream teachers would leave their mainstream school for 2 years and work in pupil referral units. And at the end of those 2 years, we'll go back and get promoted. And we had about 50 teachers do that particular route. So far, it's still an ongoing program. And I think that's big. You know, there was literally like 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 teachers in total who's expressed interest in doing that route. So I think the mindset has begun to shift a little bit, because lots of schools are seeing an explosion in need. Lots of schools are seeing this, like, you know, there's kids in every mainstream school in the country who've got behavioural issues. That's increased over the COVID period. It's come to the fore. So I think the mindset is shifting with teachers, where lots and more teachers, still probably not nearly enough, are seeing that actually that is a viable career pathway for them in their career, to learn that kind of skill set that we talked about in terms of behavior management, conflict resolution, all those things as well.
Another question that we've had come in is, what can you do or should do if the LA actually have no suitable alternative provision places?
I honestly think, yeah, thanks a lot. I've since I was young, like what led me to being where I am today and who I am today is actually taking the lead to make an impact, any impact that I can make. If it's with one person, joining forces with member of my community, I'm quite used to standing up as a community for what we believe in. And I genuinely think that like everyone on this call is here because of their passion, and they want to be here and want to see a change. And this is where, you know, we have to ask the question, what can I do? Because our communities can't just, the destiny of our community and our youth can't just be in the hands of others and people who aren't equally passionate, or people who don't understand the need. So I'm actually forced to ask myself the question, what can I do? And that's like getting on a board myself. That's meeting like-minded individuals, developing ideas, collaborating with enthusiastic teams. There's certain vibrant teams out there that you can join forces with and actually, you know, run a program and show the impact of that program, and then aim to get that replicated. But my question is like, what can we do? What does our agency afford in terms of change and transformation? Because that's what we're fundamentally going to have to rely on at the end of the day.
Anything to add there, Jamie?
Just quickly, that is a really difficult situation when there isn't enough space, and there are lots of kind of temporary fixes that are being put in place. You know, it depends on really local areas. I'm happy to discuss that with anyone who wants to get in touch, but lots of schools are now starting to shift to having an internal alternative provision set up within their grounds. So that's a temporary fix to that kind of waiting game for alternative provision that some schools are. There is no perfect fix that I'm aware of for that particular scenario. That doesn't involve sending children significantly further away from home to access AP, which even then it might not be able to due to the kind of local authority boundaries and things like that. So, and that, I mean, that's just really tricky situation and a less than ideal one, which is not a very helpful answer. Sorry.